So welcome everyone to the Riverwood Conservancy's webinar, Just Sustainabilities in Policy, Planning and Practice with Julian Agyeman. Did I say that correctly? Adgerman. I'm so sorry, Julian. My name is Stephanie. I'm the Community Program Coordinator at the Riverwood Conservancy. I hope everyone is doing well and enjoying the weather. I want to say a special thanks to Credit Valley Conservation for supporting all of the work that we do. Before we get started, I just want to mention that all of our July programs are now live on our website. And let me just flip over the next screen. There you go. Please register for as many programs as you would like. On your screen now, you should see an entire event calendar for July. Anything highlighted in yellow are programs that are coming up and are open to join. We're easing our way back into in-person events that adhere to public health guidelines, and we'll be offering outdoor yoga, meditation, and forest bathing events through July to September. Spaces are limited, so please register for as many free sessions as you'd like at the riverwoodconservancy.org/events. And if you would like to support our virtual and on-site programs in conservation of Riverwood's habitat and wildlife, please consider donating at the on our website at the riverwoodconservancy.org/donate. We greatly appreciate any small contribution to make a difference. Before we get to our wonderful speaker this afternoon, the Riverwood Conservancy would like to acknowledge that the land on which we operate is the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and the traditional homeland of the Anishinaabe, Wendat, and Haudenosaunee nations. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the lands protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. Today, this place is still home to many First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, and we are so grateful to have the opportunity to live and work on this land. And today, we have a very special speaker, Julian Adgerman, who is a professor of urban and environmental policy and planning at Tufts University. He is the originator of the increasingly influential concept of just sustainability, the intentional integration of social justice and environmental sustainability. He is the author or editor of 12 books, including Just Sustainabilities, Development in an Unequal World, Cultivating Food Justice, Race, Class, and Sustainability, and Sharing Cities, A Case for Truly Smart and Sustainable Cities, one of Nature's top 20 books of 2015. In 2018, he was awarded the Athena City Accolade by KTH Royal Institute of Technology, Stockholm, Sweden, for his outstanding contribution to the field of social justice and ecological sustainability, environmental policy, and planning. We also have our TRC volunteer, Sandra, with us to help us this afternoon. Thank you, Sandra, for being here to support our programs. If you have any questions during the presentation for Julian, please type them in the chat, the Q&A or comment section, and we will address them at the very end. So Julian, thank you so much for being here today, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Stephanie, and thank you to your organization for inviting me to speak on Just Sustainabilities in Urban Policy Planning and Practice. I'd like to offer a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking to you from Cambridge, Massachusetts, and I'm on the traditional territory of the Wampanoag and the Massachusetts people, and I want to pay my respects to their elders, their past, their present, and their future, and commit to a principle of respect and care as part of this meeting. So let me talk a little bit about just sustainability before I give you some examples that I think you will be able to use in thinking about how your organization goes forward and how your own personal practice can move forward. So it's nearly 20 years now since we broke ground with this book, Just Sustainability, Development in an Unequal World. The book came out of a realization that when people talked about sustainability, it was almost explicitly about environmental sustainability. And that's important. We need environmental sustainability. But I could see us having a green and environmentally sustainable world, but it could still be deeply socially unjust. Excuse me. So the idea then of just sustainability was, how do we get the justice that the environmental justice movement talks of? How do we get that into this new all-encompassing policy discourse of sustainability? This book, unlike most books on sustainability, where there is one chapter on equity and justice, and usually people ask me to write it. This book, every single chapter, the authors thought through their ideas in terms of equity and justice. So what we were doing really was exploring the intersectionalities between environmental equality and human equality. Prior to that, people were not really thinking about how does, say, Amnesty International's work relate to the work of, say, Greenpeace or Friends of the Earth. But, you know, I challenge you, think anywhere in the world where environmental degradation is happening, and it is almost always happening in relation to human rights violations and social injustices, whether it's the Amazon, the Niger Delta, whether it's Aboriginal lands in Australia or the Kamchatka Peninsula. Where environmental degradation is happening, there is always great social injustice and often human rights infringement. So we really then came up with this idea that sustainability cannot simply be seen as a green thing, an environmental concern, important though these aspects of sustainability are, but that a truly sustainable society would be one where we were thinking about social need, welfare, economic opportunity as integrally related to environmental limits imposed by supporting ecosystems. And I think ideas about the Green New Deal are starting to engage this intersecting social justice, environmental sustainability notion. Now, I'm an academic. I don't usually advertise other people's books, but I want you to read this book this summer. It's now 11, 12 years old, but really this book nailed it. The spirit level, why equality is better for everyone. The point that the authors make is over 40 years of data from around the world show one thing very, very clearly. It's not poverty as much, but inequality that is really literally killing us. And the countries with greater gap between rich and poor tend to have many more social malaises, from teen pregnancies to drug addiction, to domestic violence, to incarceration, you name it. As the gap between rich and poor in a nation increases, so do the social malaises. One thing that was really interesting as well, though, they looked at advertising revenues, and they found that countries with the bigger gap between rich and poor had much more money spent on advertising. Why? Advertisers love inequality. Inequality sells. Inequality makes people consume. And as I've highlighted in yellow there, inequality heightens competitive consumption. We're keeping up with the Joneses, the poor trying to get into the middle class to the upper middle class, the upper middle class into the rich into the super rich into I want to be Jeff Bezos. There's an escalator of consumption. Now, from our point of view as well as environmentalists, sustainability advocates, what does this competitive consumption do? It drives our carbon footprint. Countries with the larger gap between rich and poor tend to have bigger carbon footprints. How often do we hear people talking about climate change and talking about inequality and the need to attack and defeat inequality? We don't. We hear about sustainable transportation, sustainable agriculture. Yes, these are important, but one of the great drivers of climate change, I would argue, and this book argues, is inequality. So if we really want to focus on understanding sustainability, we should look at human equality and environmental equality together. We have made a big mistake and failed on both environmental equality and human equality because we've separated the two. Our social movements cannot cope in many ways with these all-encompassing concepts. That's why we have green groups and then we have social justice groups. We need green social justice groups. We need just sustainabilities. So how am I defining just sustainabilities? The need to ensure a better quality of life for all, now and into the future, in a just and equitable manner, while living within the limits of supporting ecosystems. And inherent in this are 4 conditions. We must commit to improving everyone's quality of life and well-being. We must do this while meeting the needs of both present and future generations, both intra and intergenerational equity. We must commit to increasing justice and equity in terms of recognition, process, procedure, and outcome. And I want to focus here on the word recognition. There is no better example at the moment, certainly in the US, than the Black Lives Matter movement as a cry for recognition. We exist. Say her name, say his name. These are cries for recognition. I can't see us moving towards greater justice, towards reconciliation, and further down the line to forms of restorative justice, such as reparations, unless we recognize the rights of Black, Indigenous, people of color, women, LGBTQ. These are forms of recognition that we need as precursors to a greater conception of justice. And then all of these three conditions must be done within ecosystem limits. Don't think of Just Sustainabilities as simply about social justice. It recognizes that our ecosystems have limits. We have to improve our human enterprise within those ecosystem limits. And just a little plug for me, the Just Sustainabilities concept both predates and underlies the concept of donut economics from Kate Raworth and Oxfam. And as you can see on the top left, I have a diagram there of the notion of the donut. We must live within the ecological ceiling, but we mustn't let people fall below the social foundation. So the safe and just space for humanity, the just sustainability space, is that donut-shaped safety place that we can live in the way that I've described in terms of just sustainabilities. Plus, I'm pleased to see that the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals really do look towards justice now and equity, giving voice to different groups, groups that have been marginalized, underrepresented, traumatized, etc. Now, before I give you some examples, I want to give you three overarching thoughts about urban planning, because that's the kind of place I hang out in. One of the greatest definitions, simplest definitions of urban planning is managing our coexistence in shared space. What a fantastic notion. Coexistence in shared space. That's what we do as urban planners. How does everybody coexist in a shared space? And whether we're talking about environmental issues, transport, housing, any other urban conflicts, we have to remember that we live in communities of increasing difference. We live in cities of difference. How do we find ways of coexisting in these spaces, in these shared spaces, from our streets to our neighborhoods, to our cities, to our regions? How do we do coexistence in shared space in the light of increasing diversity and difference? Second thing I think I want you to think about is the relationship between belonging and becoming. You know, if you look at most environmental organizations, you look at most urban planning related nonprofits, look at urban planners. We're very good at thinking about what the city can become. It can become more sustainable. It can become more resilient. It can become more sharing. What about belonging? Who gets to belong in our cities? We're not very good at that. We're not very good at recognition, reconciliation, difference, diversity, and inclusion. We've had a big wake-up call over the last couple of years, both in Canada and in the US, a big wake-up call because people are crying to belong. They want to belong. Just Sustainabilities helps us, I think, to think about what our cities can become, but we're convinced that our cities can only become as good as who gets to belong in our cities. We do not want elite cities. We want cities that move forward, that become what they can become because they are welcoming and belonging cities. And then finally, I want you to think about Just Sustainabilities not simply as human scaled planning, but I want you to put an E on the word human. I want to see humane scaled planning. I want to see planning for human dignity, planning for human capabilities, planning to unleash human potential. That's what humane scaled planning is. So I'm going to give you three examples. One based around what I call spatial justice. How do we allocate rights to urban spaces and places? Second, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I call the Minneapolis Paradox. How does one of the most green, liberal cities in the US end up as the epicenter of our current introspection over structural racism? And then finally, food justice, I'm going to offer a provocation. What is local food? What do we mean by local food in intercultural societies? So let me start with spatial justice. Not many of our cities in the world have walls in them anymore. Jerusalem does, Nicosia, Cyprus, Belfast used to. But social justice, we all know that. Life chances shouldn't be derived along class lines or race lines or gender lines. But spatial justice says opportunity shouldn't be distributed geographically. But yet we do that in our cities, especially US cities. They're zoned for segregation. That's what the basis of zoning was in the early days, as I'll talk about in Minneapolis. But there are many other ways of segregating other than walls. You can have a creek, a railway line, freeway, and on one side they live, and on the other side you live, and your life chances, your life expectancy is very different to theirs. So we live in spatially unjust cities, and luckily, geography, which is my home discipline, if you like, geography has given us the greatest diagnostic tool for spatial injustice since the map, which is of course GIS, Geographic Information System. So we can map spatial inequalities and injustices. But let me bring this down to the street. Two streets, identical width, one Massachusetts Avenue in Cambridge, near where I live, and the other one, Södervägen in Gothenburg, Sweden. Identical width, but the spatial organization of the street could not be more different. What the Swedes have done on the left is to impose spatial justice on the street. They've democratized the street by making rules whereby priority is given to transit and active transportation users, bicyclists and walkers. To the left of the streetcar, you can see a fence. To the left of the fence is the only part of the street where private vehicles are allowed, and there's not many of them because the streetcars are free and frequent, and a lot of people, although not on this picture, a lot of people cycle and walk. One thing I want you to think about, what does the kid growing up on those two streets, how do they differ? The kid walking out of the apartment blocks on Södervägen or on Massachusetts Avenue and seeing organized chaos on Massachusetts Avenue and this democratized street, how are the kids wired differently? Because in the US, access to space is basically predicated on the street in terms of your vehicle and in terms of how large your vehicle is. The bigger your vehicle, the more rights you have to space. Now, we do know that social interaction is related to traffic. On the left-hand side, you'll see the heavily trafficked street, and on the right, you see the lightly trafficked street. On the heavily trafficked street, there is less social interaction, less friendships across the street. On the lightly trafficked street, much more social interaction, many more friendships and acquaintances on the street. That's really interesting. So you might be asking, what's the Just Sustainabilities take? Who lives on the heavily trafficked streets in heavily trafficked neighborhoods, and who lives in the more tony, traffic calmed, lightly trafficked streets with trees, with bump outs, with all kinds of traffic calming measures? Go figure. Now, we do have some good news in the US. I didn't agree with a lot that the Bloomberg administration did in New York City, but one thing I did agree with is some visionary work on streets. And you can see here Times Square, top left, and you can see bottom right, Broadway outside of Macy's. Broadway is a transformed space. It's a public space. And remember, streets are the public space that we use most of the time, but we don't often think of them as public spaces. We think of them as conduits for vehicles. We've got to change that. So the other point I want to make here is we mustn't think of urban planning or sustainability as being about what is probable. We must think about them as what is possible. We won't get to where we need to be if we keep doing what we've probably always done. We need to think about what is possible. And this is what is possible. Not for every street in the city, but we can have very different cities. People streets can become much more common. And the good news from COVID, obviously, is we are rethinking streets. We have public support. People want more social activity on streets. So one good thing, I think, from an urban planning point of view about COVID is that it's made us realize the value of public space. But as I said, we're very good at telling people you don't belong, whether it's top left, whether it's bolts on ledges to stop the teenage skateboarders, whether it's armrests on public benches to stop homeless people, whether it's the egregious and horrific studs that you see top right, or even more egregious, the poor doors and the back doors. The rich doors and the poor doors. Many developers have a requirement in cities to put in a certain amount of affordable houses. Well, some more cynical developers have put poor doors in the back alleys so that people in the affordable units can go in and not bother the wealthy who get in the high-speed elevators up to the penthouse suites. Bottom left is the underside of a bridge in Seattle, where you'll notice there are bike racks. The city put bike racks in to stop homeless people sleeping there. Luckily, the cycling community in Seattle said, whoa, don't use sustainability infrastructure, don't use bike infrastructure to get rid of homeless people. We have a problem with homelessness, we all acknowledge that, but it requires policy and resource solutions, not the use of sustainability infrastructure. Very, very cynical use of sustainability infrastructure. Another book that I think would be a good summer read for you is my friend Elijah Anderson's Cosmopolitan Canopy. So Elijah's point is that most of the time when we walk around in our cities, we studiously avoid eye contact with people. But he said there are certain places in cities, and he calls them cosmopolitan canopies. And the picture on the book there is his best example, which is Philadelphia's Reading Terminal Market. These are places where people let down their guard. They are human and humane. They treat people with dignity. They watch a sports game. They sit next to people who are different from them. They talk. They eat different cultural foods. Cosmopolitan canopies are a very interesting concept. And my thought is there a role for people like me as urban planning professors, urban planners in practice, urban designers? Can we create these cosmopolitan canopies? Kids spaces are good for this cosmopolitan guard dropping. Dog parks are good. People go there, they talk about the dog, and they talk across difference. Cosmopolitan canopies should be a goal for urban planning. How do we create the conditions by which they can grow? In the US and in Canada, there's a big movement for complete streets. Bottom right is complete streets by design. Toronto streets redesigned for all ages and abilities. And the others are pictures from Massachusetts of this idea of complete streets, which has become almost a cult, a discourse, a design approach, a policy approach. But my question is, can complete streets get us away from car-centric planning that's dominated US and Canadian cities for the last 100 years? Or will it just result in enhanced livability for the most privileged residents? And so, my question is, so what is a complete street? On the right, you see the urban designer's physical approach. And then on the left, you see a street in Athens, Greece. We can't design that. That is a social ecology. Obviously, we can design the way and the proportions of the buildings and the height and things like that. But that is coexistence in shared space. That's human beings getting together and doing what we do well, which is socializing through a market. So Doreen Massey, the late great geographer, said, streets or places, streets are places, places are constantly shifting articulations of social relations through time. But most of our urban design approaches to complete streets are just physical. This disconnects the street from its significant social, structural, symbolic, discursive, and historical realities. And a really good example is Los Angeles. Believe it or not, Los Angeles is going big guns on complete streets. Los Angeles, the kind of motor metropolis, is really realizing that it needs to retrofit complete streets. But it really, until recently, it used to ban one of the most, I think, culturally vibrant expressions of diversity and difference, which is street food vending. LA is home, as you know, to a big Southeast Asian and Latinx population. Both of those cultures are focused around street food vending and socializing on the street. So how could LA say we have a complete streets policy when it bans these street food vendors? Now, recently it has begun to permit them, but not for complete streets reasons. It did it at the end of the Trump presidency because it wanted to protect the vendors from possible deportation by ICE enforcement agents. I edit a series through Routledge Books called Equity, Justice, and the Sustainable City, and here's 3 of the books. A big focus is gentrification, because one of the problems of these complete streets, these green, sustainable neighborhoods, is gentrification. Because the complete streets movement is focused on the physical, because it is in many ways trying to be apolitical, it has ignored some of the narratives that those people who live in those neighborhoods have been pushing forward. And so in many ways, what we're seeing is what we're calling greenlining. It's not redlining, which was racist and intended to deprive people of getting mortgages and home loans within neighborhoods. Greenlining is the greening of neighborhoods, which, according to one of the books in our series, also equals the whitening of neighborhoods. So the argument is then that complete streets policies are systematically reproducing many of the urban, spatial and social inequalities and injustices that have characterized our cities for the last century or more. And, you know, one of the key urban metrics is walkability. It's one of the key metrics on all of the kind of livability scales. How walkable is the city? And of course, there's an app to measure how walkable your city is, and it's called WalkScore. Who owns the app? It's owned by Redfin, the huge online realty company in the United States. So let's just take stock here. The key urban sustainability metric of walkability is measured through an app called WalkScore, which is owned by a realtor. We've compromised and commodified sustainability, so sustainability sells. And now, if you live in a neighborhood of 90 plus walkability on a scale from 0 to 100, you pay a premium to get into those neighborhoods, whether you want to buy or to rent. So we have to be very careful thinking about greening neighborhoods. How do we disconnect greening from the exclusivities, the socioeconomic and, in the US, racial exclusivities of green neighborhoods? Similarly, we can think about parks. This is a great book, Rethinking Urban Parks, Public Space and Cultural Diversity, not biodiversity, cultural diversity. And my good friend Seth Lowe said, in this new century, we're facing a different kind of threat to public space, not of disuse, but of patterns of design and management that exclude some people and reduce social and cultural diversity. How we design our spaces, how we manage our spaces, and I would argue how we program our spaces is deeply political and cultural. How about, and one project I'm working on at the moment, is co-production. How do we co-design, co-manage and co-program public spaces along with the community? Wouldn't that result in better use spaces, better socially policed spaces? It would result in what we call contact theory, or it would be a manifestation of contact theory. Contact theory says the more opportunities you have to meet people across difference, like the Cosmopolitan Canopy, the greater your tolerance and your desire for more racially integrated, culturally integrated, gender integrated communities. So I think contact theory is something you should think about. How do we make spaces culturally inclusive? How do we create spaces of engagement so that people can meet across difference? Because when people do meet across difference, they start to talk. They understand that we're just people. And it strips away all the Fox News ideas and all the horrible things that are going on in our society. People realize we're people and we want to enjoy public space. And I think we have a golden opportunity right now, given the rediscovery of public space. I don't want to say post-pandemic, but mid to post-pandemic. One thing I'm also really interested in is immigrant engagement in public open space. And this is part of a fantastic report, and I can supply it to anybody who's interested. It was called Immigrant Engagement in Public Open Space Policies for the New Boston. And they make a great point that a lot of these organizations, Friends of the Park type organizations, tend to be very well-heeled, vocal, well-connected and highly resourced white organizations. And yet we've got a situation in Boston where we've got an election coming up this fall, 6 candidates, all of color, 4 of whom are women, 2 men. the politics of Boston is changing, yet the politics and entrenchment of some of these friends of organizations isn't changing. What happens to our cities when the political leadership becomes different from the friends of organizations? How do we reconcile those differences? I'm not going to say that, you know, we're going to change Boston Common or Boston Garden, but these political realignments are certainly interesting, and I'm sure you have similar situations in Toronto. Now, thinking of belonging and engagement, a lot of immigrant groups are basically doing it for themselves. The quote here is, I think, very interesting. One of the reasons that that place is so popular with us Latinos is because of the willows. Willows in Guatemala are very common. They grow beside rivers. People like Herzer Park on the River Charles in Boston because it looks like home. Maybe one way that we can think about getting immigrants involved in public space is through this idea that I have of landscape links. Places that are redolent of your home are likely to be places that you might gravitate towards, as the Guatemalan American is saying here. Now in Copenhagen, they've opted for a different model. They've thought about how can we design in engagement and belonging. And this is Superkilen Park in a very large immigrant neighborhood called Norrebro in Copenhagen. And you can see there's three parts to the park. And the park is a linear park along a cycle path. Go figure, it's Copenhagen, it had to be a cycle path. And what the designers did is worked with the community to find out what the community wanted in the park. And they said, we want the artifacts from our home countries. So there's about 150 different artifacts in this park from all the communities represented, from Ghana to Russia to Spain to the Netherlands, a whole mishmash of different structural artifacts. So belonging through familiarity, just like the willows with the Guatemalan in Boston. I got to give a shout out to my friends at the University of Sheffield in England, the Department of Landscape, where they have this most fantastic research group called the Transnational Urban Outdoors Research Group. I published a paper of theirs in my journal, Local Environment, the International Journal of Justice and Sustainability, and you can see the paper there, Ethnographic Understandings of Ethnically Diverse Neighbourhoods to Inform Urban Design Practice. We need to move away from design charrettes towards deep ethnographies. We need to understand what communities want. We need to understand that the refugees and asylum seekers in our communities have been traumatized, and that public space can be a welcoming and soothing place for them. And this resource pack, and it's available free online, Refugees Welcome in Parks. Get it, take a look, see what they're thinking about, because the ideas are applicable in Canada as they are in the UK. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was the Minneapolis Paradox. And really, it became obvious to me. I wanted to really understand what's going on in Minneapolis, because it's one of the greenest cities in the US. It's got the best park system, 10 years on the trot, according to the Trust for Public Land. It's one of the best cities in the US for exercise. It's got the third most bike commuters. Minneapolis is a miracle. No other place mixes affordability, opportunity, and wealth so well. If you're white. If you're not white, it's not such a good place to be. It's one of the most unequal, racially unequal places in the US in terms of job income, but more fundamentally in terms of the wealth gap or the home ownership gap. It is the highest in the nation. The K through 12 racial achievement gap or opportunity gap is extremely high, white to Native American and white to black. Deep inequality. So Minneapolis is an unjust sustainability in many ways. It's environmentally sustainable, but it is deeply unjust. This is precisely what I mean by the need for just sustainabilities. So I was thinking, how do we understand this? And I found some information about a great project called Mapping Prejudice. And Kirsten Delegard said, all that civic rhetoric about Minneapolis being a model metropolis at the cutting edge of urban planning obscures some darker truths about the city. So I wanted to find out, what are those darker truths? Pre-1900, Minneapolis had a small but very well distributed African-American population. And then in the early 1900s, something happened, racialized covenants. This property will not be rented, sold, or otherwise let to anybody other than members of the Caucasian race. I won't go on to use some of the language to depict who is not welcome because it is horrifically racist, but you can go online and take a look. So racialized covenants began to gather the Black community in North Minneapolis. And you can look at maps over successive years and see this compounding of the Black community. Until 1917, racist zoning was allowed. Baltimore was the first to do it, but the racist zoning was allowed until 1917 when it was struck down by the US Supreme Court. So cities were thinking, what do we do? How do we get around this? So they thought, yes, single family zoning. Let's make it expensive. So it's not racist, but it's expensive. And socioeconomics in the US are a proxy for race. So you have large neighborhoods then that were largely white, and 70% of Minneapolis residential land is made up of single family zoning. And then you had redlining in the 30s and 40s, the idea that certain neighborhoods deemed hazardous were marked out red on a map, and no federal or private sector loans were available in those neighborhoods. So any of covenants, single family zoning and redlining were pretty effective, but the cumulative effect of all of those three is racial segregation then and now. And I'll go as far as to say there is no country in the world that has done it better than the US, other than say South Africa under apartheid, where you had to have a passport literally to go between different group areas. What is Minneapolis going to do about it? So there is a recognition. As I said, it's a liberal, young, Democrat, go-ahead city. There's a recognition of the link between this toxic, racist heritage and today's modern zoning plans. And the city is now trying to work out, how do we undo this? Put it another way, I say urban planning is the spatial toolkit for articulating, implementing, and maintaining white supremacy, and we can do something about it. So what is Minneapolis doing about it? Well, it was the first major US city, and now there's a lot of others doing it, to end single family zoning, allowing duplexes and triplexes on single family zoned land. It has increased its level of inclusionary zoning. But the Minneapolis 2040 plan, which again, I do urge you to go online and look at, goal number one is to eliminate disparities by race, ethnicity, gender, country of origin, religion, zip code. That's a very, very good aim. And there are 39 different policies around this goal to eliminate disparities. I've just highlighted three here: park design and programming, the freeway remediation. They're talking about taking freeways down, part of the Infrastructure Act that Mr. Biden is trying to get through Congress at the moment. Environmental justice and green zones. Many, many, many policies looking to eliminate disparities by 2040. And coming up to my final set of thoughts, I want to move on to looking at food. And again, a book opportunity here. If you're interested, this book is really looking at the idea of food justice as an approach to race, class, and sustainability. But the question I asked you was, what are local foods in an intercultural society? And I want to start by talking a little bit about George and Julia Bowling. About 10 years ago, I was listening to National Public Radio, and I heard this fascinating segment about this couple. They're farmers in Maryland, and they were tobacco farmers. And the state of Maryland is trying to get people out of tobacco farming. And one of the ideas that they had came as a result of them visiting Washington, D.C., and realizing that there's 120,000 Africans in Washington, D.C., most of whom are middle and upper middle class. They are professionals, doctors, lawyers, accountants, professors. They are wanting to eat African food. They don't want it flown in, they don't want it frozen. They want to eat locally grown African food. So the Bowlings, being good American farming entrepreneurs, thought we can do something about that. So they worked with the University of Maryland Extension Service to find out what African crops will grow in Maryland. And you can take a look at the resource pack that was produced. It's really interesting. So now, instead of a tobacco farm, the signboard to their farm is to the left there, African produce. And they get a lot of people coming out to Maryland and picking and then paying for and driving away with locally produced food. So what are local foods in an intercultural society? Are they what the increasingly ecologically focused alternative food movement says should be considered local? Or are they what the immigrants want as culturally appropriate foods? Is local a geographic concept, or is it a more cultural concept? Now, I'm a geographer. There is no such thing as local. Local is what we can agree on as being local. It's not 100 miles or 50 miles or 20 miles. It's what we agree is local. But what the immigrants certainly agree is that local is a cultural concept. And whether we're talking about the Africans in DC or the Filipinos in San Diego, the Filipinos were asked by a young PhD researcher, what is local food? And they said, well, it's the stuff we eat in our restaurants and the stuff we grow in our yards in San Diego. Those Africans, these Filipinos, are exhibiting what we call trans-localism. They bring their local with them, just as the Guatemalan goes and sits by the willows, or the people in Nørrebro in Copenhagen wanted local artifacts. Immigrants practice trans-localism. They bring the comforts of home here, period. You may not know this, but in Metro Vancouver, nearly 20% of the farmers are Chinese Canadians. Nearly 20%. And because of a history of anti-Chinese racism in Canada and their own entrepreneurialism, they don't use the farmers markets that the largely white Vancouverites use. They've created their own network of Chinese farmers markets. So there are parallel farmers market networks. Now, I gave this talk in Vancouver about 10 years ago, and a young East African woman came up to me afterwards and said, thank you so much for saying that about the farmers. I shop at the Chinese farmers markets because they supply the food that I want to eat. All of these different ideas of localism, trans-localism, food justice, they're all mixed, and we need to start thinking differently and more progressively. About 2005, the largest urban farm in the United States, South Central Farm in Los Angeles, was ripped up by a developer. It was the largest farm, 95% Latinx farmers. And here's a picture of two women in the farm. You'll notice they're growing culturally appropriate crops, but they're also growing them in a way that they used to grow them back in Oaxaca. And again, every time I read this, the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I planted this garden because it's a little space like home. We grow the same plants that I had back in my garden in Oaxaca. We can eat like we ate at home. And this makes us feel like ourselves. It allows us to keep a part of who we are after coming to the United States. The Guatemalans, the people in Nørrebro in Copenhagen, the Africans in DC, the Filipinos in San Diego, the Latinx people from Oaxaca in South Central LA. They want home here. So we need to think about this. Your organization needs to think about this. How do we do this in a way that is authentic? We do it by co-producing environments. I can't see another way. We cannot design environments for people. We need to co-produce environments with people. That's a tweetable moment, folks. Just bear that in mind. Another very interesting development is this network of refugee farms across the United States. This is New Roots Farm in San Diego, but there's about 50 of these community farms all over the US, from Burlington to Lowell, Massachusetts, to Minneapolis, Phoenix, San Diego, where immigrant farmers are learning with and teaching local farmers in a kind of intercultural learning way about agriculture. So they're getting a first footing in US agriculture. And this is no different in many ways to, the first farmers, the settler colonial first farmers who came as newcomers from Scandinavia or from Netherlands and Germany and settled the Great Plains, 150, 200 years ago. This is the new agriculture in many ways. Final book ad is for my latest book, The Immigrant Food Nexus, Borders, Labour and Identity in North America. There are 3 chapters in here from Canada. You might be interested in this. It's actually available, open access online if you Google it. But what we were really interested in here is how you cannot talk about immigration in the US without talking about food. 50, 60% of US food chain workers from the fields to the restaurant are immigrants, many of whom are undocumented. Similarly, in Canada, you have a lot of immigrants working in food. So we call this the Immigrant Food Nexus. Anyway, no time to go into it. Please do take a look online, and I'm sure you'll find some interest in there if you're interested in kind of food studies. So let me summarize. Just Sustainabilities in policy planning and practice. We need to manage our coexistence in shared space better. We need to foster belonging as well as becoming. We need to foster engagement and belonging using deep ethnographies. We need to understand communities. Let's co-produce local ethnographies so that we understand in a more nuanced and deep way who the community is, what are their desires and dreams. But we know that one of their desires and dreams is to have a little bit of home here. We know that. We need to engage intercultural, culturally competent planning and policy making. I would now change the word cultural competent to cultural humility. I prefer the term cultural humility. Culturally competent sounds like it's too managerial. Like, I'm level 5 culturally competent. What are you? Oh, I'm only level 3. Cultural humility is what we need to practice. We need to practice humane scaled and human scaled urban planning and design. And above all, the message I really want to leave you with, social justice never simply happens. It never has and never will. We don't come to social justice by accident. It needs to be centered. It needs to be intentional. It needs to be mindful in planning processes and practices. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Julian. Another impactful presentation for sure. I saw you at another conference, and that's actually how I reached out to you. And the presentation is really informative. It leaves you with a lot to think about. So we do have some questions coming in. So I wonder if you have a couple of minutes to answer those questions. Thank you so much. So one that came in very early into your presentation is, do you see a relationship between donut economics and zero growth economics?
Great question. I mean, yes, there's a relationship. I mean, see, I see sustainable development as a different kind of development, not zero growth, no more growth, but I see sustainable development as an explosion of growth in human capabilities. I think about the movement for smart cities. People talk about, oh, we need more smart cities. What do you mean by that? Most people mean, let's wire up the city, let's collect a load of data, let's get everything technically, expedient so that our cities can perform better. But I see the other side. I see smart growth as being about unleashing the massive human capabilities. And how do cities do that? The smart city is the city that can unleash fully human potential. So I don't see it about zero growth. I see it as about a different kind of growth, a qualitative growth rather than more of a quantitative type of growth.
Thank you. Another comment came in from Carol, who said, I noticed in England, some of the towns would have pedestrian-only streets in their downtown area. Also, some Europe cities have squares with no cars, only people, parks, restaurants with outdoor cafes. I thought it seemed more civilized way of living. Any comments on this?
Yeah, it is a more civilized way of living. Yeah, I mean, not only car-free streets, but you also got the development of what are called shared streets now in Copenhagen, in London, where there are no markings, there are no traffic lights for cars, cyclists. People can use them. But you know what happens when there's no traffic lights or markings? Car drivers drive very, very slowly. And so the principle of shared streets works because the car drivers have to go at the speed of the walkers and the cyclists. Now, not every street can be a shared street, but I think larger proportions of our cities can be given over to these people streets. And it does make places more civilized. I was in Paris a couple of years ago, and I just remember not hearing traffic, but just the throng of human voices. No traffic, but human voices, you know, from the sidewalk cafes. And this sidewalk ballet of this cacophony of sound was just really pleasing. We don't need to hear traffic. We should hear human voices. It was heartening. And in some ways, certainly here in the US, post the worst of the pandemic, we're now starting to see streets being taken over, that cars are being pinched to 2 lanes instead of 4 lanes by streets becoming people streets, restaurants spilling over. I spent time in Montreal. I really like what they do in Montreal when finally, when the warm weather comes, you know, Montreal opens like a desert flower. We need to do this. We need to reclaim the streets. We've been talking about it for a long time. Well, now we have I think, the public support and the rationale to do it.
You're getting a lot of questions coming in now. One question says, during COVID, there's been a lot of talk about the importance of green spaces to the mental health of people living in cities. Are there any studies regarding the mental health impacts of COVID on communities with less access to nature or fewer opportunities to feel safe in nature?
Yes, there are. There's a lot of studies. You know, there have been a lot of studies for a long time, as the questioner says, on the benefits of contact with nature. But there's also now a lot more on the benefits of nature for underserved groups. I mean, a big revelation, not so much a revelation, here in the US has been that, you know, those redlined neighborhoods that I talked about, those neighborhoods that were deemed hazardous, which were largely African American or Asian American or Latinx neighborhoods, they have less trees, and summer temperatures are substantially higher in these formerly redlined neighborhoods. So again, another connection to our racist city planning is summer heat and a correlation between deaths and redlining. You know, this point of mine about urban planning is the spatial toolkit of white supremacy. It is unfortunately true. Similarly, if you think about food deserts, I mean, people think about food deserts sometimes as being just an economic thing, that supermarkets aren't going to locate there because all the people are poor. You actually trace the history of US food deserts, and again, it's related to redlining, racist city planning. And so another point I would make, we cannot dissociate human hunger from racist city planning. You know, racist city planning has an embodied effect in the form of food deserts and human hunger. So yes, I think certainly here in the US, there's a lot of research on the racialized effects and the spatialized effects of racism, whether it's access to nature, whether it's access to trees and the shade that trees give. It's huge. And of course, it's come at the right time, at this time of racial reckoning. And thankfully, the foundations, NSF, the National Science Foundation, there's a lot of money going into further research. We actually don't need further research. We now need action. We need policy and planning action.
Thanks, Julian. Another question came in: how do we create equitable spaces in societies when only the wealthy people can buy into an area, suburb, that has desirable elements of livability, walkability, close to jobs, etc.? It seems only the wealthy have these perks. It's a really good comment, and I know it's a huge issue in Toronto, especially with the rent and cost of living right now. So if you want to comment on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, you know, look, I mean, gentrification and displacement are two huge issues. And the geographer David Harvey made a great point. He said, we're building cities for people to invest in, not to live in. And Toronto and Vancouver are really good examples of that. That really, it's not about home anymore, it's about an investment in many ways. So gentrification will continue till we dissociate these two. The best example of I think creating a livable city is somewhere like Vienna, where you've got apartment buildings, you've got much more social housing, apartment buildings where immigrants and wealthy people live together, and you've got a high quality of life. Vienna regularly, like Vancouver, and Melbourne tops the livability tables. We can do it differently, but we have to tackle this idea that cities are places for people to invest in rather than to live in. Until we do that, all the anti-gentrification strategies, whether it's community land trusts, whether it's robust affordable housing policies before we do greening, whether it's what's called just green enough, which is where, excuse me, which is where some communities are saying, hey, we don't want all these super green amenities. We just want you to clean up the neighborhood to a public health kind of level. And this has been applied in Brooklyn and various other places. These are band-aids until we get to this point where we return cities as places for people to live in, not to invest in.
Thank you for your wonderful answers, Julian. I wonder, do you have time for 2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. Is just sustainability hampered by the competitive capitalist mindset you mentioned? Is it fully achievable without a considerable change in that mindset, or is just sustainability a part of the solution to this mindset?
I mean, I could spend the hour talking about the economics and the economic woes of this world. Just sustainabilities is an idea that, inherently in it, although I haven't mentioned the word, is redistributive. It is about redistribution. It's about rethinking urban resources, and not just urban resources, but I focus on that because that's my kind of job area. But just sustainability is about thinking about how do we redistribute resources, access to places and spaces. It is a critique of neoliberal capitalism. But if you look at, say, donut economics, that more directly focuses on the economic aspects. I focus mainly on the sustainability and environmental aspects of whatever forms of reform. Well, actually, reform isn't the right word, and transition isn't the right word. I mean, if we seriously thought about just sustainabilities, if we seriously thought about giving access to, and not just financial access, but access in terms of, if we think about public transit, at the moment, what we're doing in public transit terms, certainly in the US, we use one metric. We use ridership. Ridership is going down in public transit in the US, period. And then Republicans can say, oh, look, nobody's using public transit, let's get rid of it. Or let's defund it, let's move on to something else, on-demand services. How about changing the metric? Let's see if we can use another metric, not just ridership, but how could we measure access and demand for public transit? Because that's going up. That would then change the narrative. So all of this is a way of saying just sustainabilities is a way of reframing narratives and a way of looking at urban issues so that we, rather than accepting orthodoxies like ridership is going down, we start to think about increasing ridership by increasing demand. And so, you know, I'm very much into this idea of narrative change as a precursor to, well, and a driver of policy change in many ways, policy and climate change.
Wonderful, thank you. And then one final question. Do you know of friends of park organizations that are doing it right?
Excuse me. Not many. I mean, you know, many of these look, and I don't blame these organizations. You know, there's no blame in what I'm saying here. I'm just saying that these organizations have come about to both keep things the way they are, but also to make some changes. And who are the best able to do that? They are professionals. They are people with expanded networks, encompassing wealthy donors and politicians, etc. And these organizations themselves, I think, would like to have more diversity. I was on the board of Massachusetts Audubon Society for about 5-6 years, and they get it. They understand that Massachusetts is changing, and that in 20-30 years, Massachusetts, people will have skin colors more like mine than, say, yours. It will be a majority-minority state. How will organizations like Massachusetts Audubon Society survive if they haven't made inroads into these communities? And those wealthy Anglos are dying out. I mean, if you look at the average age of Massachusetts Audubon Society members, it's an aging organization. How do these organizations make the transition to the new Canada, to the new Boston? I'm not saying I have the answers, but they need to make that transition. In Massachusetts, we have a large Brazilian, Cape Verdean, Syrian. We have all of these different ethnicities. They're interested in nature. Surely Massachusetts Audubon Society, whose motto is protecting the wildlife of Massachusetts for all its residents. Well, it's very good at the first part, protecting the wildlife of Massachusetts. It's not so good at the second part for all. Does Mass Audubon understand what the conservation and wildlife and other needs of some of these new communities are? Does it understand that? Has it made any inroads into trying to find out? Similarly with these friends of organizations, they largely meet, you know, at somebody's home behind closed doors. Are they making inroads? Are they doing deep ethnographies of communities to find out who's in the communities and can they bring them in? On a very, you know, mercenary level, these organizations need the new Canadians, the new Bostonians to survive. How do they do that?
Well, thank you so much, Julian. What a phenomenal presentation. Gives us a lot to think about. And thank you so much for all the resources as well for our viewers and staff, even at the Riverwood Conservancy, to look into. I wonder if you have any final words for us before we say goodbye this afternoon.
Okay. I wish I'd said this. I wish I could claim these were my words, but they're not. Sustainable development means using our unlimited mental resources, not our limited natural resources. Phenomenally insightful. So sustainable development doesn't happen out there first, it happens in here. We need to unleash these phenomenal mental resources, not use up our limited natural resources. And my final thought is, I'm glad the timing of this worked out, because in 2 hours, England is playing Denmark, and we've got 55 years of hurt. I was alive in 1966 when we won the World Cup, and it's been downhill ever since. So think about me, people, as you get on with your day.
Yeah, there's a lot of excitement here in Toronto too, so for sure.
Can we get a raised hand for, oh, well, we can't see them, but I'd just like to know who's supporting Denmark. And I'm going to send a nasty email to you.
Well, thank you so much, Julian. What a great presentation. We really appreciate you.
Brian, I don't like you. Brian, I don't like you.
Watch out, Brian. It's a good thing we're across the screen, right?
Yeah. All right, thank you. And listen, and I'm happy if people want any resource that I mentioned.
Yep.
If people want them, just either go through Stephanie or email me directly. I'm happy to do that.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Julian, again. And we will see everyone in the next webinar. Have a great afternoon, everyone. Bye-bye.